Welcome back. Today what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be pulling the front cover off this engine, and I'm going to be retarding the camshaft timing. And there's two reasons I'm going to be doing that. Reason number one is that gas is just ridiculous right now. It's almost $5 a gallon. And I'm hoping by retarding the camshaft a little bit with a little bit later intake closing event, it might just get a little bit better fuel economy. And the second reason I'm doing this is because this engine does ping a little bit when it's very hot. It's set up 2 degrees advanced right now, and whenever you advance a camshaft, you increase the dynamic compression ratio down low, and sometimes that can lead to ping. So this is all a big gamble. I don't know if this is going to work or not. It may get worse fuel economy, I don't know. But it's only going to cost me a timing cover gasket to try this, and I have 2 good reasons to attempt it. And I know it's probably going to rob a little bit of low-end torque, but hey, this is a 5-liter in Bronco. It doesn't need that much power to start with, so it's overkill right now, so it's really good. Yeah, and it'll add a little bit up top, so that's what everybody says. When you retard the camshaft, you'll gain a little bit up top and you lose a little bit down low. So what I'm trying to do here is not affect the horsepower too much, but I am trying to improve the fuel economy a little bit. And from what I could dig up online, it could be anywhere from 2 to 4% improvement, theoretically. So, and I know for sure that it will help with pinging. When I originally built this engine, I built it with a carburetor. And when you advance a cam on a carbureted vehicle, they run better down low. They pull more intake manifold vacuum, and they're just generally better all around. However, I've found from experience that long runner fuel injected intakes don't like a lot of advance. They prefer retard. So I'm going to go ahead and retard a little bit and see what happens. You can follow along. All right, here we go. Once again, I'm going to be pulling the front cover off the engine, timing cover. And that's the procedure that you need to do if you're going to do timing chain and gears on a small block Ford. So I'll go over that procedure. I'm not actually replacing the gears. All I'm going to do is just adjust them, because I have an adjustable set of gears. But if you were replacing a set of gears in a small block Ford, this is exactly the same routine that you would go through. And the first step in that is going to be for me to remove the radiator. Get that out of my way. So this happens to be an Explorer 5.0. The reason I mention that is because the front cover is set up a little bit different than typical classic Ford small block. Because for Ford to fit the 5.0 in the Explorer back in 1996, 96, they had to change a couple of things. Because there wasn't a whole lot of underhood room in the Explorer to start with. It was never designed for the 5.0 to be crammed in there. So they shortened the front of the engine by using a shorter water pump, a shorter harmonic balancer and pulley assembly, and different brackets. And they shortened it enough so that they managed to get that engine in there with a mechanical fan, which was quite a feat. And for those of us that are cramming these engines into a very small engine compartment for which a V8 was never designed, those are useful parts. So when I built this engine, I actually had an Explorer front dress that I'd saved from a different project. And I utilized that in this engine. This engine's out of a 92 full-size Bronco. But parts are parts, and the Explorer front parts went on this engine no problem. And here we are. Just like Ford, I was able to install this engine with a mechanical fan, which I definitely prefer if they're on for a vehicle. There was the air accident did all the plan, huh? Now I come out of there. Alright, now with the radiator out of there, I've got a ton more room. Let me re-angle the cameras a little bit. Next step, pull the belt. I happen to have a special tool for this, but it's not required. You just use a breaker bar or a ratchet. Since I'm going to be reusing this belt, I'm going to hang it up somewhere in the direction of rotation. I want to put it back on in the same orientation. I don't want it to flip around back there. I can break this loose without destroying it. Where there's a pry bar, there's a way. Or a big hammer. Or a welder. Bypass those off. I do believe I can reuse that. Okay, looks like I'm going to have to pull. I can pull the tensioner out of the way and leave the alternator in its bracket, but it doesn't look like it's very hard to pull the whole thing off at once. So I think I'm going to go that route. I don't think I'm going to do that over here though, because I want to create power steering links, so we'll leave this side alone, but I will take this off. I'm going to pull the alternator bracket and assembly, which means I have to disconnect the B+ wire from the alternator. I'm going to try and do that live. Normally you would disconnect the battery when servicing this terminal, because it's got very high amperage capability, 12 volt all the time. What I'm going to do, I'm going to carefully pull it off without touching any grounds. So no alternator case, nothing that's sheet metal ground. And I'm just going to wrap it with tape. And the reason I'm being lazy and doing it this way is I don't want to wipe out my radio station settings. There we go. Let that hang right there. Now I should be able to just unplug this plug and pull this whole bracket complete assembly right out of the way. What size are those? It's too big, just right. The other one is a different size. Too big. Too big, that's going to be a 9/16. Typically on these old school V8s, everything that bolts to the engine is SAE. Everything that does not bolt to the engine is metric, which makes it fun, of course. This should be 3 bolts. Let me find them all. There's the other one right there. Which means that hose has to come off. Get rid of this out of the way. What I like to do with these hoses is get them spinning first, if I can, and then just pop them off with a pry-bar. That way you don't destroy the cloth inner lining that gives it strength. Okay, so those two are loose. That one was loose. It isn't going to work, it's too long. One bolt down. Like this, because it's going to, oh, just remembered. I have got my intake bolted to this bracket assembly, and that has to come out. And since I'm going that far, I might as well put the intake off the bracket before I pull the bracket out of the way. Now I could work around all this stuff, but I'm a believer that if it takes 5 minutes to pull something out of your way, that's the better way to do it. And there's our alternator bracket. It didn't fall in the coal nut. Okay, there we go. Alright, I'll pull the lower hose off the water pump. Now, if you were doing this on a vehicle that had a whole bunch of miles on it, and the water pump had not been apart in all that time, you would, at this point, you would just go ahead and pull the water pump off the front cover, because you really would want to inspect the water pump, make sure that it's not leaking out of the weep hole, and at least clean it up and replace the gasket, because paper gaskets do have a shelf life. You don't want to leave them on there forever if you can help it. And every Chinese set that I've ever seen will come with a water pump gasket. That's why you got to make sure that the set that you buy is for the exact vehicle that you're working on. The timing cover gaskets will all be the same, but for instance, on this Explorer, the water pump gasket will change. So I ordered it for the Explorer engine, knowing that the timing covers would be all the same. However, the intake gasket, or I'm sorry, the water pump gasket is going to be different. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the engine on top dead center. And if you were really doing this the right way, you would pull number 1 plug out and either put a compression gauge in that cylinder or stick your thumb over the hole and rotate it around until you felt compression in the spark plug hole. But if you don't do that and you line up the marks and you happen to be at the top of the exhaust stroke instead of the top of the compression stroke, the only thing that's going to change is your marks. Your crankshaft mark will be correct, but your camshaft gear will be 180 out. And that's perfectly fine. It doesn't hurt a thing. You just have to know that going in. So I'm going to go ahead and pull the front cover off, and if I really want to do it right, once I get it apart, if I see that my marks are not 6 and 12, but they're 12 and 12, then I can rotate the crankshaft one turn. That'll bring the cam gear down, so they're 6 and 12, and then continue on. So I'm not going to be too worried about it. But if you wanted to do it the right way, what you would do is pull number 1 plug out, and on the Ford it happens to be the front right plug, and just stick your thumb in there while you're rotating the crank around. And when you felt air coming out of that spark plug hole, start looking at your mark and bring it up slowly clockwise until your marks line up. And that's top dead center on the compression stroke, which is where you want to be. All right, here's where we are at. We've got the alternator bracket and alternator out of the way. And I've got the alternator B plus lead taped up because I'm too lazy to pull the cable off of the battery, because I know that will wipe out all my radio stations, so I was very careful not to touch anything when I did that. And now we can see the timing cover down in there. And I'm going to try and work around this power steering pump and bracket so I can get the camera down in there if I need to show you certain things. But the next step for me is going to be to get it on top dead center. It's actually very close right now. You can see my mark is almost right on the money. Now this timing pointer, you can also see it doesn't belong to this Explorer setup. And I've got my top dead center groove on about the 18-degree mark on the balancer. And I've got a paint mark where 10 degrees before top dead center is. I've got another one up here at 20. It's kind of to see that I measured those out when I assembled this thing. And that's really all you need. So base timing on this is 10 degrees before top dead center, so I got a paint mark which shows me that. And I'll just double check that. Now when I move the camshaft on this engine, it is going to change where the distributor relationship is, because the cam drives the distributor. But since I'm going to retard the cam 4 degrees, I'm actually going to retard the distributor like I'm out. So we'll have to readjust that. Alright, I'm just going to slide the balancer over so that the marks line up. Right about there. And now I'm going to get this idler pulley out of the way. The other reason I like to pull the radiator out when doing this, I mean, there's some engines that give you plenty of room between the engine and the radiator, and sometimes you can just pull the fan off and get in there and work, but one errant slip of a screwdriver or a ratchet handle can go right through a radiator, and now you've got a leaky radiator, so I prefer just to get it out of my way. There's still a condenser in here I have to be careful about, but it's far enough away I think I'll be okay. Water pump pulley to water pump bolts are an oddball size. They are, well, they're not oddball. They're 7/16. I really should have probably broke those loose with the belt still on it. So as I was saying, if you were taking the front cover off of a 302 or a 5 liter that the water pump had not been replaced in many years, you would just go ahead and you would pull the water pump off the front cover. And I would probably recommend replacing it since you're already there. But in my case, this one's just been apart within 2 years. So I'm not going to take these bolts that hold the water pump to the front cover off. I'm only going to take the bolts that go through the water pump and through the front cover out. And the reason for that is I don't want to separate the water pump from the front cover. It's not leaking. All I want to do is get the front cover out of my way. So I'll pull all those loose, get them out of my way, and then go ahead and pull the front cover out. But before we do that, we need to get the balancer off. So I will do that next. This requires a somewhat specialized tool, a harmonic balancer remover. These could be rented from parts stores. They're not that expensive when it comes right down to it to buy. And not a bad thing to have. Yet another reason for pulling the radiator out of the way is so you have room to get an impact on the balancer bolt. That right there saves a lot of effort. So there's a big washer, typically, that goes underneath the bolt's head. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the washer off and I'm going to thread the bolt back down in there because the type of pusher remover that I have is designed to push against a flat surface. So we need something flat to put in there so we don't damage the threads inside the crankshaft. So I will thread this in a couple turns. Without the washer, the balancer will come right over the head of that bolt and leave the bolt in the crank. So we'll set that up in just a second. But before I do that, I need to take the bolts out of the pulley. Oh, never mind. This is not that style. Yes, this is an Explorer balancer pulley assembly and it's all in one piece. So we don't have to do that. Typically, the pulley will bolt to the balancer. And we can remove the bolts that hold the balancer and pulley together, pull the pulley out of the way. And then, once you get the pulley out of the way, you have holes left over that you can thread these bolts into to attach the harmonic balancer remover to the harmonic balancer. And these are looking to be a very small bolts. Let's see if I can get in there and see what size I need. It's a pretty fine pitch thread as well. The bolts go through like so, thread into the balancer pulley assembly. And I'm just going to ratchet this in and pull the whole assembly right off. I didn't have two matching bolts, so I had to shim one. But the thread pitch is correct, so it should work. This one actually takes 3 bolts. Most of the Fords actually take 2. This one is different because it's an Explorer. Now I'll run this center bolt in, which will pull the balancer off the crankshaft. It's a press fit under the crankshaft. This is one place where domestics and imports differ. Usually an import will be a slip fit. Once you get the bolt out of the way, it just slides off. Most of the classic domestic V8s are press fit, interference fit, and they have to be pulled off. They still have a retaining bolt that holds everything together, except if it's an older Cadillac. Those were pressed on with a special tool, and that's it. That's all they're holding on. Could have put an air ratchet on this, but I had the wrong air fitting on my air ratchet, so I'll just do it the hard way. And there we go. So that's how that works. Pull the bolt out. So once you get the washer off the bolt, it will slide through there, no problem. But if you leave the washer in place, it will not. Alright, at this point the only thing holding the front cover on is the bolts, but I do have to go underneath, and I'm going to go underneath and loosen the oil pan bolts about halfway back to the engine. This has got a silicone gasket on it, so I'm going to loosen them back quite a bit, and then I'm going to take the ones that go through the oil pan into the front cover completely out. And I'm going to shut the cameras off while I do that because it's going to take a little while. Alright, I've got the dirty work done. I went underneath on a creeper and I pulled out these 4 bolts. These come up through the oil pan rail into the timing cover. So they have to come out. There's 2 1/2-inch ones and 2 7/16 ones. Those are out. And now I can just pull the front cover bolts out. This thing is essentially going to come out. But I wanted to show how dry this engine is. It's not leaking. Been on the road for 2 years, and it's a Ford that doesn't leak oil. I think I'm going to go play the lottery. But seriously, if you use all late style gaskets, and by late I mean silicone, not cork, then you can create a Ford that doesn't leak oil. It is possible. Okay, so I removed 4 bolts that go through the oil pan rail into the front cover, and I loosened a few back behind that because this has a steel oil pan on it, and there's a lip on the front cover which requires the oil pan to have to flex down a little bit in order to get it loose. If it had an aluminum pan on it, I might have to actually loosen all the bolts, because aluminum doesn't flex nearly as much as steel does. But in this case, I've loosened a few of them. It should be enough. So now I can just grab a socket and an impact and zip all my bolts out. This thing should be pretty close to coming out. I also, while I was down there, I pulled the block drains out, and I drained the block. Now I was hoping I could do that with my air vac, but when I pulled the lower hose off, I noticed that there was still a whole bunch of coolant in the engine, so the air vac didn't get it all out. That one can stay. That one comes out. That one comes out. That one comes out. And there's a few more. That's a short one that stays. Take that one back down. Let's see, oh, that one has to come out. Grab a mirror and see if I got them all.
actually can pull this out completely. This is my timing pointer. Set that aside. We have, let's see, that one is loose, that one is loose. It's only the long bolts we're going to be pulling out. Those are the ones that go all the way through into the block. Oh, there's one I missed. Okay, there's one down there I have to get. The other one's good. Actually, that's a short one. No, it's not. That one goes through. Okay. That should be all of them. Now I'm wondering if that other one goes all the way through. No, that was going to be short. But let me start prying on it and see if it moves. And we'll make the determination if it starts moving or not. Yeah, I think I got them all. So if I had forgotten the bolts, when I put the power bar behind it and started wiggling it, you would notice that it wouldn't move. It would be hung up, and that's your signal to stop prying and start looking for more bolts. This one seems to be just about out. Now I leave all my bolts in if I can, for the simple reason that get this gasket up in front of the nose of things. For the simple reason that I don't have to figure out where they go if I do that. Just leave them in the cover. Alright. There is our front cover. I've left all the bolts that I could in there. This one I did not listen up. That just holds, these two hold the pump, or these four I should say, hold the pump to the front cover. They don't have to be removed if you're not pulling the pump. And there's a lip. This is why you have to loosen the oil pan bolts, so you can get over that. And I'm using a silicone rubber gasket. I need to be careful not to tear it. And when I go back together, I'll just dry it off really good and put some silicone in here on the outside of the gasket and bolt it back together. Get this out of the way. Now when I do these, I will typically, for the gasket, if I'm assembling an engine, I will use an adhesive to glue the gasket to whatever component that I'm bolting to the engine, and then I will use something like Never Sees on the side of the gasket that faces the block. And the reason I do that is so if for some reason I have to take that component back off within a week or two, it should just pop right off and I don't have to replace that gasket. But this one tore, so I'm going to have to replace it, and I'm going to have to scrape the block down. But such it is. Sometimes you can save it, sometimes you can't. Okay, let me get rid of these gloves, and I will show the marks. So this thing is going to be either 6 and 12, or it's going to be 12 or 12. We don't know yet. It's 12. 12 o'clock. Why is that mark way over there? Oh, because I've got it 4 degrees advanced. So that's my 4 degrees advanced slot. There's 3 slots on this crank here. So that would be your straight up slot right there. And you can see the mark. And then this is the 4-degree advanced mark, or slot. And then over here is going to be the 4-degree retard mark. So that's where we're going to put this one, is 4 degrees retarded. Let me grab some sockets and get this timing chain off, and then we'll go from there. This is probably a 9/16, it is. There's a little bit of red Loctite on there, so it was a good idea. So this thing is a top dead center, but it's on top dead center on the exhaust strip. In order to get it top dead center on the compression stroke, I would have to rotate the camshaft around one time. The crank gear and the cam gear are not an interference fit. Sometimes they get sticky. And here we go. So that's our crank gear. This is a what they call a multi-index crank gear that will give you some timing adjustability. So if you wanted to put it straight up, you would put this pointing out. If you wanted to advance the timing, you will use that slot. And if you wanted to retard the timing, you'd use that slot. So I'm going to clean this stuff up. I'm going to turn the camshaft and turn the crankshaft, or actually not the crankshaft, just turn the camshaft and get it 180 degrees turned so that it's actually going to end up 6 and 12 the way that it's supposed to be. And to do that, I don't want a piston at top dead center because it might impact the valve. I don't think that these are an interference engine, but the way to solve that problem is to just back the crank up just a little bit so that the piston's not right at top dead center. I'm just going to turn the crankshaft counterclockwise about 15 or 20 degrees, which will pull the pistons, all the pistons below the deck. And then I'll rotate the camshaft gear one turn, and then I'll bring the crankshaft back up to top dead center. And then I'll line everything back up and put the timing chain and gears back on. So let me turn the camera off while I do that. I'll be right back. Okay, I backed the crankshaft up a little bit. I put the bolt back in the cam gear and I rotated that 180 degrees. So now the mark is now pointing at the crankshaft. 6 and 12, that's what we want. So now let me take this out real quick. Alright, so here is straight up. You can see that our marks are at 6 and 12. You'll also notice that the keyway, the tooth, and then the valley of the tooth are all lined up. So to retard our camshaft, what we're going to do is we're going to rotate the camshaft counterclockwise a little bit. It's not a full tooth. It's a fraction of a tooth. So we want the camshaft to be behind the crank a little bit, so as the crank turns, the cam timing is late. If you were advancing, it'd be just the opposite. You would be advancing the camshaft ahead of the crank gear a little bit, so that your valve events would happen sooner. So we can see this relationship. If you look at the keyway slot, if we go to our advance slot, so you can see the crank is now behind the camshaft gear slightly. So the cam is ahead of the crankshaft, so it's advanced. If we come over here to our retarded tooth, now you can see that the crank is ahead of the cam gear just a little bit. So
the camshaft is behind the crankshaft. So it's late. Camshaft timing will be late compared to the crank, compared to top dead center. And that's basically all there is to it. But you can't use one full tooth. That would be too many degrees of crankshaft rotation. So they'll cut different slots in the gear to give you some flexibility. You can go farther than that, because if you notice, it's kind of in between two teeth. So if you wanted to get really picky, there's really two settings right here. There's a setting where, in this instance, this would be advanced, but what if you moved it like so? Now it's retarded quite a bit. So you can do that for the other tooth as well. And the only way to figure out how much that is with a degree wheel or with the specifications of the timing set that you have. So there's actually more than 3 settings here. There's 5 settings that you have. And the only one that's straight up is going to be our straight up mark, which is that one right there. Alright, so we need to put this thing back together. I'm going to get started on that right now. The first thing I have to do is bring the crank back up where it's supposed to be. It's pretty close to top dead center. It's actually going to have to go past top dead center, I think, because the crank is going to lead the cam just a little bit. Yep, that's it. Okay, so here we can clearly see that the crank is straight up and down, keyway is straight up and down, and you'll notice that it doesn't line up with the tooth because we're in the retard slot on the gear. And if you compare that to where the cam is, you can see that the cam hasn't quite lined up yet. It's behind it. So the cam is retarded. Now my next step is just to clean gaskets, so I'm going to grab a razor blade and start scraping all of this paper gasket material off the block and off the timing cover. I'm going to have to line that back up. It's slid in just a little bit. That side's okay though. And then we'll start putting it back together. All the bolts threaded in, that means the gasket's lined up and in place. Okay, cover bolts are tight. Should probably go under there and tighten all the oil pan bolts down right now, because it'll be more difficult with the balancer in place. Okay, balancer time. Now on these balancers, on any balancer really,
you'll want to do something. You'll want to put a little bit of silicone inside here, like so. Because if you don't, you could end up with a mystery leak and you'll think it's a front seal, when in actuality what's happening is oil can be wicking between the crankshaft and the balancer. So you just put a little silicone in there, and I'll put a little silicone on the threads of the bolt as well. And that will eliminate that possibility. The other thing is that there's actually a special tool to put these on that you're supposed to use for two reasons. One, you really shouldn't be hammering a balancer at all. It's not good practice. And the other reason is that if you use the bolt to draw it in, sometimes you can rip the threads out of the crankshaft. You don't want to do that. The bolt will usually survive. It's the crankshaft threads that will suffer, because cranks typically are made out of cast iron, and the bolts are typically made out of steel. So this one I'm going to pull in with the bolt because I know that this interference fit isn't great. The balancer slid right off. And when I thread the bolt in, it threads in 4 or 5 turns. So I know I've got pretty good thread contact in the crankshaft, and I should not have an issue. So I'm going to go ahead and put some silicone on the bolt. Like so. And thread it in. And right down. And for this, I'm going to turn my gun down quite a bit. So right there's where I usually do lug nuts. That's 60 to 100 foot-pounds. And that's about what crank bolts are supposed to be torqued at. So. So that's what you're not supposed to do, but I got away with it. Okay, let's see, what's next? Wire pump pulley, I guess. Alright, the pulley is next. Voltmeter bracket. Be careful here, this is a positive cable. And Serpentine Belt is next. just remember how this goes, I think. Through. Looks believable. Yeah, I'll scoot over when I start it. I probably should have put the hoses on first before I did that. That wasn't so bad. In a way, it's actually best to do it that way because if I ever have to do a field repair, the clamps are in the right place to take it off without removing the belt. And am I ready for the radiator? Yeah, but I'm going to put the lower hose in there and put one clamp on it. It'll just make it easier. Now I can stick the radiator in. Okay, lower hose, upper hose. Okay. I haven't put coolant in it yet, but I'm going to go ahead and see if it starts. All right. So it runs. Timing is obviously going to be out. I'll adjust that in a little bit, but before I do that, I have to get cool in it, so I'll go ahead and use the air vac to speed things up. So it'll also tell me if I have any leaks. And we'll just let that sit there and percolate for a few minutes. If there's a leak, that needle will slowly drift up into the red. So I just got a gallon jug of coolant here. I'm going to stick this in the end of it. And then just open up the ball valve. So you might be thinking, well, Rick, if you wanted fuel economy, why did you put a V8 in this thing? And truth be told, in the beginning I didn't. In the beginning this was a 4-cylinder, which never existed in real life except for very low run diesels that Ford did. But the base engine in the Bronco has always been either a 2.8 or a 2.9 V6. I'm going to stop that right there because this coolant is a little dirty at the bottom of this bucket. I have some more right here. So I started out with a Lima 2.3 liter that I had, and I went looking for something to put it in. And I really wanted a Cherokee, but I just didn't find any good Cherokees. And this popped up on Craigslist one day, and I got this. I bought it with no engine, no transmission, and rebuilt the four-cylinder that I had and stuck it in here. And the stock manual trans option on the older Ranger and Broncos was a Toyo Koigo. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correct, but it's a Mazda-made 4-speed and 5-speed. And I just happen to have one. And unlike any of the newer transmissions used in Fords, the bell housings are replaceable in those transmissions. So I hunted down a 4-cylinder bell housing and put it together with a 4-cylinder 5-speed using a stock transmission and a stock transfer case. But it just didn't have enough power. So I experimented with a turbocharger, but when I built it at 9-to-1 compression, which is too much for a turbo. So one day I thought, okay, I'm going to pull the head off and I'm going to relieve the combustion chamber to drop the compression ratio, maybe stick on a thicker head gasket. And the turbo that I was using, I had it wastegated at about 6 psi. It wasn't much. It was just enough to give it a little bit more oomph, but I really wanted it to run on 87 octane, which it would not do. It wouldn't even run on 93 octane with ping. So I pulled the head off and the head was cracked. And rather than just replace the head, I went ahead and rebuilt this engine, which I already had, and stuck it in. So the 4-cylinder was getting 21, 22 miles per gallon highway. This engine is getting 16, 17 miles per gallon highway, which really is not too bad if you think about it. So if I can tweak here, tweak there, and get a little bit more out of this, get it up to 18 even, I'll be happy, really. That's within 2 miles per gallon of the 4, with a whole lot more drivability. So that's my goal. I'm not a 5-liter fan because in most instances anywhere a 5-liter will go, a 5.8 will go as well. But the nice thing about the 5.0 is it's quite a bit tinier than the 5.8. This is not true with General Motors V8s. General Motors V8s are all the same deck height. They're all 9.2 inches, small blocks. But when Ford built the 5.0, they built it with an 8.2-inch deck height, and they built the 5.8 with a 9.5-inch deck height. So the 5.0 is quite a bit smaller. It will fit in places that no other V8 will fit. And it's pretty light, too. So for this swap, it was the perfect engine. It dropped in pretty easily. Wasn't a whole lot I had to do. I did body lift it, and I did shim the cross member down to get a little bit more bell housing clearance, but it drops right in. And it's a lot easier than a 5.8, a whole lot easier. If I had a Mustang, I'd probably put a 5.8 or a Cleveland in it, but for this, because the engine compartment is so small, I used the 5.0, and that fits in there pretty good. So that's what happened. Will I ever switch back to a 4-cylinder in this? Maybe. If I could get one that was low compression and turbocharged and ran on 87 octane, which is a lot to ask, I might consider it. But really, I think the future for this vehicle is going to be a diesel swap. So finding a small fuel-efficient diesel and sticking that in is probably where I'll be headed with this. And I'm still thinking about which engine to choose. So if you got any suggestions, throw them out there. Put them in the chat. Curious to hear your viewpoints. I thought about Volkswagen TDI. I thought about OM17 or OM617 Mercedes, but I don't know if an OM617 Mercedes front pan will clear the crossmember. I got to do some measuring. I got to find one and get a tape measure and do some measuring. I've only got about a foot between the cross member, and the radiator. So if the Mercedes front sump pan to water pump pulley or fan is less than a foot, then it would fit. Or I could switch radiators, because this radiator is pretty thick. I mean, that's a couple and a half inches maybe, I don't know. A thinner radiator and reworking the core support to tuck it underneath would be better, but we'll see. That's way in the future, at least a couple of years. I got another diesel here behind me that I have to put together first. So bearings just came in for that one, so we'll see a video on that one pretty soon. And we'll also see a video on voltage drop testing. That'll be the second video that I'm going to do on electronics for automobiles. So I'll talk a lot about voltage drops. But okay, for now I'm just going to set the timing on this and go for a drive, see how she runs, see how much power I took off the bottom end. And thanks for watching.